this kind of analysis leads one to think that there's been an intra-EU goods trade boom that's been going on. And the reason that the UK has not, why its exports to the EU have tracked those to the rest of the world, is that it hasn't taken part in that boom. So if it had grown as rapidly as, if UK exports to the EU had grown as rapidly as EU exports to each other, then they would be about 27% higher. One of the reasons why you think that the Brexit has not hurt UK trade is that in goods exports, we haven't seen UK goods exports to the EU perform much worse than UK exports to the rest of the world, which I think is a perfectly reasonable claim, and it has been a real puzzle for those of us who assume that the EU is our largest trading partner. The single market had effects on trade that we can measure. So therefore, why don't we see goods exports to the EU doing much worse than goods exports to the rest of the world when we've imposed trade barriers on goods exports to the EU? And that's kind of shown in this chart here, which is very similar to one that Catherine showed. And you can see that the red line is UK exports to the rest of the world. This is all goods. And they've tracked EU exports to the EU. So how do we solve that puzzle? The second puzzle I just wanted to think through is, which Catherine also alluded to, is why have services exports been doing quite well since Brexit? For those of us who, all of us think, I think, that the single market in services was not particularly complete and was much stronger in some sectors than others. But even so, the gravity models suggest that there is more services trade between EU members than one might expect, given how rich they are, how close they are to one another. And so we would expect there to be a clear impact on UK services exports if we leave the EU, and suddenly it's harder for financial institutions, for example, to do business with customers in the European Union. So I just want to think about those two, rattle through, but I just want to think about those two issues because they are a real challenge to those of us who do believe that Brexit has had an impact on trade. The first thing saying, these are the evil doppelgangers that have been so controversial. But this is UK goods exports in total, and the way that this kind of exercise works is we take a whole bunch of advanced economies, and then we kind of create a synthesized UK economy based upon those countries within advanced economies whose trade performance is most similar to that of the UK, up to the point of leaving a single market and customs union. And if the UK performs much worse than that kind of synthesized UK economy, then we think, okay, there's an impact of Brexit here. If not, then no. And we can see that using that kind of analysis, which has been very controversial, but has some strong empirical grounding, and is widely used in the social sciences, then we see a quite big shortfall in UK total goods exports. You see a shortfall of about 13%, and we see that the recovery in UK goods has been rather weaker than that of the synthesized UK, the doppelganger. So how do we explain this conundrum? We've got UK goods exports to the EU tracking those to the rest of the world, but then we see using this type of analysis that there's a shortfall. And I think the answer is that if we compare the UK's trade to the remaining EU member states, then we see some pretty big differences between intra-EU trade, European exports, European countries' exports to one another, and European countries' exports to the rest of the world. If you remember, the UK's exports to the EU, the red line, and the UK's exports to the rest of the world, they've been kind of tracking each other pretty much. You can see that. But the EU member states' exports to other EU member states has grown massively. it's up to, 2019 is 100, so it's up 40%, So that's a big difference and much higher than the UK-EU line. And then with EU to the rest of the world, there's a bit of a difference we can see, EU exports to the rest of the world, but it's not nearly as big. So this kind of analysis leads one to think that there's been an intra-EU goods trade boom that's been going on. And the reason that the UK has not, why its exports to the EU have tracked those to the rest of the world is that it hasn't taken part in that boom. So if it had grown as rapidly as, if UK exports to the EU had grown as rapidly as EU exports to each other, then they would be about 27% higher, about a quarter higher. And just thinking through, I mean, Catherine mentioned some different sectors. And I think it's really important to look at sectors in a kind of broad way, because I can come up with all sorts of sectors where there have been big impacts of the UK leaving the EU, and it's really obvious, like chemicals, for example, or there are particular issues in the supply chain of particular automotive products where there have been very clear impacts on UK exports. But if we look at sectors in a fairly broad kind of way, then we can see that UK exports to the EU have done much worse than EU exports to the EU since December 2020, i.e., the end of the worst of the lockdowns, or the beginning of the end and the beginning of the recovery in goods trade. And we can see that in food, live animals, beverages and tobacco, that UK exports to the EU are up 15%, whereas the EU exports to each other are up 40%. Chemicals, UK exports to the EU were down 12%, while EU exports to the EU were up 32%. Material manufacturers, we don't really see much difference in UK exports to the EU for 3 years, but we see it's a third higher between EU member states. No difference in manufacturing transport equipment, and I think Catherine's slide was very interesting on that, actually, and I agree with a lot of what she said. And then finally, miscellaneous manufacturers, which is just everything that doesn't fit in anything else. And then we see a big effect as well. And so overall, we can see that the UK exports to the EU have been doing much worse than intra-EU exports. So moving on to the services question, and this I'll be brief. This, I think, it's still a bit of an open question, but I have a pretty horribly coloured chart. I'm sorry about that. I have at least an idea about why UK services exports have been doing apparently so well. And again, you have to think about demand. So if generally demand for tradable services has been rising, perhaps because of pent-up demand during COVID lockdowns, then you would expect the UK, which, as Catherine says, is a very strong services exporter, for their services to do well. But the question is, would they have done even better if there weren't some constraints? And I think this chart suggests that perhaps they would have done. So we can see with telecoms, computer and information services. So this is how has the UK's exports grown as quickly as the average of advanced economies globally? And if it's just naught, then it means no, UK exports have grown at the same rate as advanced economies. If it's positive, then UK has grown faster, and negative, UK has grown slower than the advanced economies. And we can see that in telecoms, computer information services and other business services, it's been about the same. Insurance and pension has skyrocketed. I have some ideas about that, but nothing very concrete. But in financial and transport services, we can see that since 2019, the UK has been growing more slowly than the average of other advanced economies. And that kind of makes sense, because those are the two sectors of the single market which are most developed. Heard all sorts of complaints about financial regulatory harmonisation when we were members of the EU. And so leaving that system, where if you do leave it, then there are lots of things you just legally are not allowed to do as a bank, that's got to have some impact on your financial exports. And we can see that that's true, that financial services exports have grown more slowly in the UK than the average of the advanced economies. And then with transport services, we've seen a hit to goods trade. Transport services is quite a lot of lorry driving, shipping, moving goods around. And so it makes sense that transport services have been growing more slowly than the advanced economy average. And that's kind of it. The final point I would just make is that if you add up these impacts on services exports, then it essentially amounts to about a 10% overall shortfall in services exports. If you add up the impact on goods exports, then it amounts to about 13.5% shortfall. And those figures are the figures that people put into the kind of models that predicted somewhere between a 2 and 7% impact of Brexit on GDP. So we can argue about whether that is what the impact would be, whether we would end up with a trade hit leading to those kinds of impacts on GDP, and the jury is definitely still out on that. But that evidence is the reason why I believe that there has been a large impact of Brexit on trade. Thank you.